All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar. Thank you all for coming. I hope this finds you all safe and healthy. Today's topic is centered around GDPR and privacy regulation. So first off, all you brave souls get a gold star for coming to the session on GDPR on a Friday afternoon. This is one of the final sessions in our virtual conference. I hope you've all been enjoying the conference so far. Do you want to take a moment to mention that our final session will be this afternoon at 4:15 Eastern. That's going to be with PepsiCo and Allstate talking about top-down and bottom-up feedback. If you haven't had a chance to register for that one, please take a moment, go to our website, OrgVitality.com, and do so. It's going to be a great session. It's one I'm really interested to attend. And there's still some time to sign up. For our session right now, before we dive in, just a couple of housekeeping notes. The first is about the slides. So don't worry about taking detailed notes. We'll be following up with all attendees probably early next week. We'll follow up with some conference-wide materials that'll include the slides used today, as well as recordings. So sit back, take in the information, and let us know your questions as they arise. If there's time at the end of today's webinar, I'll answer some live. Time might be a little tight with just 30 minutes, so if I don't have a chance to answer them live, I will answer them via email, so please just submit them through the Zoom Q&A portion, and we will get to those. The other opportunity to provide questions or feedback will be a survey at the end of this. So as you leave the webinar, you'll be directed to a survey, of course. We'd really appreciate your feedback on how the sessions today have been, as well as your ideas for future sessions, and of course, any specific questions on what we talked about today. Again, we're happy to follow up with any feedback you have there. So with all those housekeeping pieces taken care of, we'll go ahead and dive in here. Want to start by introducing myself briefly. My name is Victoria Hendrickson. I'm a partner and vice president on the consulting side here with OrgVitality. I have a PhD and background in IO psychology, which takes me to my next point. Given that we're talking about GDPR and some legal regulations here, I really want to state the obvious. I'm a survey nerd. I have zero legal training. The content I've pulled together for us today is based on our collective experience here at OV and guidance that we've been provided by our attorneys. It's not intended to be legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. This is simply an overview of GDPR. Most of you on the phone have in-house legal teams or counsel available to you. So please, as you finalize any practices around GDPR, please consult with those experts. All right, with that out of the way, we can actually dive in here. Just had to get that disclaimer out here and in print. Let's start with the basics of GDPR and why we're all here. So GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation, and it went into effect about 2 years ago, May 25th of 2018. So at this point, a lot of us have probably heard of this. Maybe it's come up in different survey practices, but it is worth reviewing some of the foundations before we look at specific survey practices to make sure we're all in compliance. If we look at the goal of GDPR, it's to provide individuals with greater transparency and control in regards to how organizations collect, store, and use their personal data. This is most relevant to citizens in the EU, although one thing we'll talk about is that countries all over the world are enacting similar regulations that really follow the structure of GDPR. So for the most part, if you think about GDPR as your gold standard, that's a good framework to start with, and then you can bump up specifics within each country. One thing we're going to get into is that GDPR really wasn't written with employee surveys in mind, but employee surveys are covered in the regulation, and repercussions for non-compliance with GDPR are quite serious financially. So while there isn't a lot of precedent for non-compliance in employee surveys, it does look like it could be quite steep. So every client of ours is really going to great lengths to adhere to this, as are we. So again, while we aren't lawyers, we did retain an EU-based attorney that specializes in GDPR to help us guide our clients in how GDPR applies to surveys and some of the other things we do. So that's really where a lot of this framework today is going to come from. So Before we talk about survey implications, I want to step back and again continue to put GDPR in that larger context and how we all got here. So again, as a lot of you have probably surmised in your own work, GDPR really wasn't designed for employee surveys. GDPR was designed originally as it became clear that big data is a trend that's increasingly integral to the way a lot of businesses today advertise and operate. So as we all find every day, as consumers, we provide personal data both actively and passively through interactions with different platforms. Just think about all the things you click through when you're online throughout the day, or different apps you use. You're providing data constantly, and companies are mining this data, often to advertise to you in a targeted way or provide you with a service. This combination of individual personal data being very readily available and different organizations' ability to use and profit from this data provides some unique ethical questions around privacy. So GDPR protects the individual's rights to understand when their data is collected and how it'll be used. And I think we can all agree that that's a great thing. That's something we want to happen. If we then take a step forward to this conversation we're having today, why are we talking about GDPR, and why do survey professionals shudder at the mention of it? Frankly, I don't know any survey professional that gets real excited about GDPR. While it was very much intended to protect consumer data in the context of data mining and advertising, GDPR does apply to organizations collecting and storing sensitive individual data. So when you think about collecting and storing individual data, by those criteria, some employment data is covered. So while GDPR wasn't written for employee survey data, in a lot of circumstances, it does apply. So I do say within some circumstances it applies. Let's take a look at when it does apply and what's really required. So if we're going to look at some of the survey implications here, I want to start with the fact that GDPR regulates individual level sensitive data for people that are in the EU or other select countries. The map here at the bottom has a lot more details. Again, don't worry about squinting too hard right now. You'll all get these slides that do have a lot of detail about the specific regulations across countries. Of course, you're going to want to think about your population in greater depth than what's on this map, but this can be a quick start to give you a sense of who's under regulation. The next immediate piece, when you pass thinking about your population and whether they're under regulation, is to think about whether you have individual level identified data. So first piece, if you're talking about an anonymous survey, well, where people are not identified, they're all using one common link, this just doesn't apply. We don't know who that individual row level data is coming from, so that really doesn't fall under GDPR. However, most survey programs and employee research streams are talking about more identified data in confidential surveys. So if you find you are talking about individual level identified data for folks under regulation, marked on this map, then we do move into the next piece and making sure that the data collection is compliant. So we'll take a look at what that means here. And we're going to look at this across phases of a survey. So let's start with the phase of work before a survey even launches or when the research work begins. The first task is to understand what kind of data you're collecting. This is geared at limiting the unnecessary use of sensitive data. So for the most part, when you're running your surveys, we're talking about employee opinions or standard organizational demographic information. But if you're collecting sensitive information, let's say you're doing research on sexual orientation, or one that's becoming more and more popular is gender orientation, past kind of binary definitions, there's probably going to be enhanced precautions you need to take since that falls into a much more sensitive category. And when it falls into a more sensitive category, this often means that you need to consider why you need the data, and you might need to be prepared to make a business case. A few years ago, before we had to think about GDPR, we could simply use all of the data available to us, and research, that's very useful to have as many data variables as possible to run different analyses. We didn't have to be, quite as buttoned up with our research plans or hypotheses before collecting data. We could kind of figure it out as we get there. Now, with GDPR, we need to know ahead of time what we're going to use that data for. Especially if it's sensitive, we need to make that business case of why we need it. Because if we can't make a great business case of why we need it, we want to protect the individual's privacy by essentially not having access to it. So one thing to consider before your survey launch is, what's your research plan? What variables do you need? What do you plan to do with them? If you can make a case for it, I don't think there's a concern that you'd be limited, but that is an extra proactive step to make sure you've thought through your research plan. So, that's some of the pieces in terms of actual data variables. Before you start collecting any of those variables, you have to confirm that you have a plan to store that data appropriately. Often that means storing it in the EU or, depending on the country, storing it in the country it was collected in. And another piece, only storing it as long as you really need that. So, again, if you have a business case of, needing specific data for, let's call it 5 years to do longitudinal research, that's often approved. However, if you don't have a need for it beyond a year or two, you would be encouraged to destroy the data as soon as you no longer have a use for it. So again, thinking ahead to what data you'll need for how long. One practice we often see is that opinion data can be kept for a very long time for longitudinal analyses, but perhaps those more sensitive demographics are only needed for a very short period of time, and by destroying it after that short period of time, fewer people are going to have access to that sensitive data in the future, and that'll protect our individual employees. So, once you've confirmed your plan, you've confirmed what fields of data you need, where you're going to store it, and how long you're going to store it, we can move on to the middle phase on this page and data collection more generally. During survey administration, the main point we want to emphasize is the need for transparency of data use. So, the first phase was really about only taking what we need. The second piece is making sure that employees are very clear on what's collected and how it's going to be used. We want to make sure that there's a statement that clarifies to the individual the purpose of the data collection, as well as contact information should they wish to delete their data or not take place in this. So the most important pieces here are going to be your data privacy communications and an informed consent. So your informed consent sounds awfully research-based, but it is becoming more and more important. This is often a statement before the employee takes the survey. Here's where you're going to explain who's collecting and processing the data, why it's being collected, how it'll be used. Let employees know where it'll be stored and if it'll be transferred. And when I say if it'll be transferred, that's between organizations or between locations. And again, you're providing them a first line of contact in your organization of where to go if they have questions or want to take any action. One change with GDPR that we've seen is that rather than just providing this information or making it somehow available to employees, they need to actively accept this statement to move forward and take the survey. So we can't assume that they saw a privacy FAQ somewhere or assume they read something. They need to be shown this information and then press some button that either says accept or read and accept before they move on and can start providing their data in the survey. And then that'll take us to the third phase here, following survey close. After the survey's closed, we want to focus on an employee's control of their data. And this is often where people have the most questions over what are employees' rights to their data, what's reasonable to do here. So we'll start with what the regulation looks like, and then we can talk about how we handle different kinds of requests. So first thing is make sure employees know their rights about their ability to ask about their processing of personal information. Often what this means is being able to provide them with a copy of the personal information held by you, the client company, or the vendor. So what this means is, maybe after they take the survey, they email into a help desk and they say, I want to know what personal information you have on me. And there should be a process in order to provide that. The second piece that often comes in conjunction with that is the ability to request a correction or deletion of their personal information, or object to you having any of that personal information. So if they do request their personal information and they see, perhaps one of their demographics is coded in a way that they don't agree, or that's not how they identify, perhaps either race or gender or one of those that are more sensitive, they need to have a system where they can change that or ask that you delete that piece of their personal information. Another piece is their ability to complain to a competent supervisory authority or a court of law if they feel their rights were violated. So this is one that we really don't see a lot with employee surveys or employee data. However, it is part of the GDPR regulation that if they felt you had a piece of information that you shouldn't have or that were misused, it should be very obvious, very easy for the employee to escalate and have that resolved. So, altogether, this sounds like a lot, but really the pieces we see over an employee's control over their data is they most often, want to have access to what data you have on them. There should be a process for them to be forgotten if they want their data removed. And another piece with this is limiting the access of other people who can see this raw or identified data. If there is individual row level data, you do need a process to, again, feed that back to the employee, but it should be fairly contained with a trusted set of analysts within the organization rather than broadly available. So, each of these pieces here are important and worth thinking through, but they are fairly easily handled with transparent communication systems and research planning. When we talk to clients and walk them through a table like this at this stage, almost always the question is, what does this actually look like in practice? And in particular, how involved do these requests get? So for example, any of these bullets, if an employee asks about them, how common is that and what does that look like? So that's going to take us to the next slide in terms of what we typically see. And here, I'll share with you what I fondly call anecdata. It's hard to give you a really scientific summary of how GDPR issues within employee surveys shake out, frankly, because it's still really early. Organizations are finding their way through this. But I can summarize what we've seen at OB since GDPR was enacted. So the first component that you work on for GDPR compliance is typically that privacy statement that explains what data is going to be used. And what we typically see here is that a legal department will get involved quite a lot. So your legal departments are a great first place to start. They will have an opinion on, how in-depth this privacy statement should be. Often what we find is organizations that have a strong use of GDPR for their consumer or product divisions will have an even more locked down privacy statement, since their legal teams are used to kind of a higher threshold of privacy within GDPR. The other thing that often comes up with the privacy statement is the different works councils in the EU generally like some input in this, although I've never seen a works council ask for something that legal hasn't already thought of. With the informed consent statement, and that's that statement that employees need to actually accept to move forward and take the survey, it's really quite similar where legal and perhaps those works councils get involved. Here they're looking to make sure that the statement is understandable, that it really makes sense to your average employee taking the survey. The privacy statement might be a little more legalese, but the informed consent should be really clear so that employees know what they're agreeing to. And that's something we often see the works councils looking out for. Here's where we move into some of the survey administration kinds of pieces. So if we think about an employee's right to request or edit their personal data, I'd say we'd get, and this is a technical term, a handful of curious requests. Because you do get employees reading the informed consent in a detailed way, then I would say, we get a few throughout the year where they say, hey, I didn't realize you had a lot of personal information on me. What do you have? And so there, the process is that we as the vendor alert the client that we've had this request, and we explain to them that, they're under legislation to send that over. And I would say it seems to be out of the employee's curiosity, and they want to know what the company has on them. And none of those have ever escalated any further. So there have never been any requests to change the data, delete the data, or contest it in any way. But employees kind of just want to see what you've got. But again, it's important to have a system. It's not an overwhelming amount of people that ask about it. Same thing with right to a copy of responses. So at the end of the survey, sometimes employees want a copy of how they responded. By the way, we see some companies provide this copy of responses anyway, but often employees want to hold on to it for when they enter action planning conversations later. This tends to not be super sensitive. And that takes us to perhaps the most difficult one, which is the right to be forgotten. So the right to be forgotten is when an employee provides their data and then comes back and requests that their data is deleted. This is a more nuanced one that we'll dive into in a moment, but this is certainly one that's worth thinking through so that you have the right reporting systems in place should you have a right to be forgotten request. But again, we've seen less than a handful of these throughout the years. And so that takes us into the next piece here. And while the instances of employee requests are really minimal, you do want to be prepared with a good process of how to respond, and you want to be able to act quickly should these things arise. So what should you do? We'll start with the first thing here. And as we go through, you'll see that the overarching goal should be to respond to the inquiry in full as soon as possible, with the caveat of not burdening the business or compromising the confidentiality of other employees. So the requests for data fields or responses is usually a pretty easy one, and one that you can ask your vendor to complete for you. So that's pretty straightforward. The request to be forgotten is a bit more complex. If an employee wants to be forgotten or have their survey record removed, the way you handle it depends on where in the reporting timeline you received the request. If you receive the request while the survey is still open, this is easy and you lucked out a little bit. You can remove the response from the database before any reporting structures have even been created. If you receive the request when the survey is closed, but reports have not been run, you're still on the lucky side of this. You got it just in time, but it might require some extra checking. You and your vendor can remove that case from a database, and it won't affect any existing reports or reporting structures. The tricky bit is, what do you do if you get this request after reports have been distributed? While we really want to honor the request, we don't want the removal of one person's data to drive any existing reports or reporting groups under minimum N in a way that might compromise other responses, if you were to compare old and new reports. So, generally the approach here, and it is going to vary across all of your programs and how things are set up. So again, this is generally speaking, you can keep the employee's response attached to the hierarchy, so manager roll-ups and reports, but you would remove all identifying and demographic information associated with it. So this way, the response to the opinion item stays within that manager report, so it's not going to change their report or drive anything under minimum N, but that individual is no longer recorded in your database. So you're removing their employee ID and any personal information. This means that any future ad hoc reporting, such as if you run a gender report or tenure report, this can't include their response because you don't know who provided their response. Or if you were to do linkage research, you wouldn't be able to link this person back to anything or provide them with a specific identity. So overall, I'd say we're trying to honor employee requests, but we do need to balance that with the burden to the business, and two, we don't want to risk the confidentiality of all the other people involved. So those are fairly straightforward answers for some straightforward programs, but I know many of you on the phone have more nuanced kinds of programs that will have different kinds of applications and ways that we would think through GDPR. One is life cycle surveys. Think about things like onboarding or exit surveys. Those fall into a unique category. They have much smaller minimum N, and often they're reported in single cases. Another piece is integration of different kinds of listening programs. That brings up other issues. Integration of different programs provides much more insight across a life cycle. However, it does require the identification of individual cases in order to link those together. Same thing with other kinds of employee research, where again, you really need that row level data in order to draw meaningful conclusions, even if you're not thinking about the individual themselves. With each of these, I would say the implications over reporting will vary with the nuances, but the overarching guidance is to honor the transparency around data use. So especially with employee research, let employees know their data might be used for research in the future, and to respect their control over the data. So, perhaps you have a time frame of when they can request to be forgotten, and make that really clear to the employee. So that's specific to some programs. From here, I want to clarify what different roles and involvement in GDPR look like. GDPR distinguishes between two roles in terms of responsibilities. There are controllers who determine the purpose and means of the data, and there are processors who run and store the data. Generally, the client company is the controller and the vendor is the processor. As the controllers, if you're based in the EU or if you have EU employees, you really have to check with your vendor to make sure that they're going to provide you with all of the processes and sort of compliance pieces we've talked about today. Really, because the difference here is that the GDPR regulation is going to hold the controller most responsible. And so bottom line, you're on the hook for the GDPR compliance. Your vendors hopefully have a lot of these processes in place, but it's up to you to make sure that your vendor understands GDPR, interprets it the way you do, and essentially has all of the practices you need in place. So with that, I've talked a lot about what's happened and how survey programs are complying in their current state, but I want to take a moment to look at what's ahead and think about what questions we might see in the future. The first is, how widespread is implementation? Right now, GDPR is most required in the EU, but it is becoming best practice to apply this across populations. So, if you have a portion of your employees in the EU, to still apply GDPR practices across your entire employee base. That way it's consistent. We will see other countries, continuing to enact similar legislation. So this will help you get ahead of it. I do think interpretation questions will become more nuanced as we continue to discuss the balance of privacy ethics, transparency, practicality, and burden on the business. We're going to have more and more data that we can look at, and more research questions we can ask, but we do need to balance that with employees' transparency into the kinds of research we're doing and kinds of questions we're asking of the data. So lots of possibilities here, but certainly planning to do to make sure we're doing it in a compliant way. So we're almost to the end of our time today. Those of you that are still interested in GDPR and want more, I encourage you to download the app Calm. One, meditation is supposed to be very important in the increasingly stressful world we're living through a pandemic, but two, it's added highlights from GDPR. So there's actually a piece you can download on Calm where a BBC radio announcer, his name's Peter Jefferson, reads highlights from the GDPR with the goal of helping people calm down and fall asleep. So I would love to hear from any of you if you download it and whether it's effective or whether you learn more from GDPR. So with that, that's going to close us out on the content for today. If you do have any questions, again, please put those in the Q&A box and I will get to them. Coming up in just 15 minutes here, we have another session on feedback from both Allstate and PepsiCo. I'd love to see you all there. Following this webinar, you'll also see a quick survey about the session. Please give us your feedback. And then just to close out, I did want to mention that OrgVitality is offering a free employee well-being and business resilience survey. This is to help organizations get the information they need during the pandemic. So this is a pulse survey based around different aspects of working from home, leadership, and information that we all need to understand what our employee base is going through. It's available in 13 languages. We've already had 35,000 employees take the survey, so there will be some great benchmarks and findings. We'd love to share those with you. If this is something you're interested in, please head to our website, orgvitality.com. And that'll conclude our webinar for today. I'll be following up with each of you individually. So for now, thank you and stay safe.